Welcome, I'm Sean Spear, the Project Director at the Ontario 360 Project here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. As viewers may know, we've been releasing policy papers over the past several weeks covering issues of interest to the province of Ontario. We've released policy briefs on topics ranging from intergovernmental fiscal relations to the skilled trades to foreign credential recognition, fiscal policy, and so on. And this week's no different. Today I'm here with George Vegh, who amongst other things is an adjunct professor here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a leading expert in energy policy and regulation. And today he's contributed a policy brief on reforming the governance in and around electricity procurement here in the province of Ontario. Thanks, George, for your contribution. Thanks for participating in another successful policy breakfast session. And I think, hopefully, starting to galvanize a renewed focus on governance reform with respect to electricity procurement here in the province. Maybe just to start, can you give viewers a sense of some of the key insights and analysis of the paper?
Sure. Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this project. I think it's a really great one, and thank you for inviting me to do a paper on electricity policy. The main thrust of the paper is that we're about to, as a province, engage in a new round of policy procurements. It's been a few years now because we've had excess supply for a long time, but we're now going to need some again. And what I'm proposing here is that we take this time to consider the governance that we've had for electricity planning and procurement, because it really hasn't worked well in the past. Ontario's been sort of an outlier in how it's done this. It's addressed electricity procurement of supply on a very political basis without any independent oversight. And it's been a cost to us. It's costed us billions of dollars, more than it should have for these assets. And that has led to political consequences where we're now subsidizing electricity rates to the tune of over $5 billion a year. So, we don't want to go back down the road that we went down before because we know where that leads. So I'm proposing an approach here that is more aligned with the mainstream of electricity procurement in North America. And it's also more aligned with the mainstream of what we do in this province for other electricity infrastructure, which is to have independent regulatory review of both procurement processes, planning. As I say, we already have regulatory review of planning for other energy infrastructure. So I'm proposing that we just treat electricity supply as a normal piece of energy infrastructure subject to the same sorts of processes that we now have in place for other energy infrastructure.
There's so many threads to pursue on that answer, but let me just pick up a couple. The first is, as you say, what may surprise viewers is that the oversupply problem that has really bedeviled policymakers for the past several years will soon become an undersupply issue, and that's why, as you say, the government or the ISO is going to have to go back to market to procure new energy sources for the medium and long term. The second is the extent to which there's been problems in the past. It's ultimately a governance failure, and that if the government doesn't get the governance issues right, there's a high risk that we make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. Viewers, I think, would be surprised to discover how little independent oversight or analysis or ultimately involvement there is in electricity procurement. Can I just give people a sense of briefly how we've gotten to this mess, a combination of poor forecasting and political interference in the decision-making process has kind of led us to a world where we have some of the highest prices in North America?
Yeah, and as you can appreciate, it's a complicated issue, but what we've never done in this province is subject electricity supply forecasting or procurement methods to independent oversight. And as I said, we do that with respect to forecasting for other energy infrastructure, and it's worked out pretty well. As to why it is we haven't done that in electricity, I think that's electricity supply. That's it's a complicated issue, but what is interesting is that there was legislation in place which would have required this review but I think it was probably when the government introduced the Green Energy Act. It was just, and Green Energy Act gave an opportunity or right to connect anywhere in the province for renewable power. You could just see how that model is just inconsistent with any planning, because by definition it wasn't planned for. The system just has to accept renewable power wherever it is. So I think the immediate cause of the breakdown of that particular model was the feed-in tariff model, but it's a chronic problem we've had in Ontario that goes back to Ontario hydro days, and always an idea that Ontario, we wanted to keep decisions around electricity supply in the provincial government, and a real reluctance to let that go. Mm-hmm. And that's permeated the current system, where the government gives directions to the system operator on procuring electricity, and sometimes those directions are transparent, but sometimes they're not. Mm. They work very closely with that operator, with the system operator, and I think the OEB, who does the energy oversight on these other investments that I've discussed, the Ontario Energy Board, they just don't feel, I think, that they're in a position to question issues of government policy. So even though we have a regulatory regime in place, it's really not being used. Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the policy brief in a lot of ways is a warning to the Ontario government that as it gets set to embark on another round of procurement, it hasn't solved for the governance problems that contributed to the woes that we've had over the past several years. And the policy brief says, here are some ways to fix the governance problem so that this next round of procurement goes more smoothly. Can you give viewers a sense of some of the options that you think that ultimately would be better than the status quo?
Sure. So I put forward three options. The first one is closest to the status quo, where, as I mentioned, the OEB hasn't exercised regulatory oversight over procurements of the ISO or procurement process or planning by the ISO. So one option is you just make that subject to OEB review. And as I said, there was legislation in 2004 which set up that model, mm-hmm. But there was a transitional provision which said until we get this whole plan and review underway, the government can continue to provide directions. And like many other areas, the transition
15 years later.
15 years later, this transition is still operative. So that's one model. Yes. A second model that we propose for consideration is that electric distribution companies, which now have the obligation to secure enough distribution wires, enough poles and wires and other resources to meet electricity demand and have their plans reviewed and their costs reviewed by the OEB, to add on to that obligation, the obligation to procure supply. Mm-hmm. So you just treat supply like you do any other infrastructure that the distributors have to plan for, have to include in the capital plans, and have to try to get rate recovery for. So that's a pretty straightforward application of the current model. And I should say the first model of ISO oversight, that's a model for every other jurisdiction in North America that has a system operator. So there's nothing unusual about that. Yes. We're actually the outlier by not having that in Ontario. And the distribution oversight or the distribution responsibility, again, that's what we do with the rest of the electricity sector. That's what we do with the gas sector. Again, it's pretty mainstream sort of solution. And then the third option is, again, something we do in the province. What we have, so for example, with nuclear assets and baseload hydro assets owned by Ontario Power Generation, those are rate regulated by the OEB. So Ontario Power Generation comes in for a rates case, just like a utility does, and says, here's our forecasted costs, here's the recovery method, and the OEB reviews it and has a hearing and determines whether that's all prudently incurred and should be recovered from ratepayers. So another model is you say, well, just expand this idea, and so if generators want to offer supply to the province, given that our markets are pretty risky, so no one's going to just invest on spec in this sector, then the generator can come forward and go to the OEB and try to get rate recovery in the way that Ontario Power Generation now gets rate recovery.
Mm-hmm. Well, any of these options, as the paper observes, would establish a more solid governance foundation for the future procurements than what we currently have. And so as the government begins the process to procure a new round of energy supply, electricity supply, hopefully they're thinking about governance, and if they are, they will benefit from reading your policy brief. Thank you so much, George. Thank you for your contribution. Viewers can find George's paper along with the others that we've produced over this tranche of policy briefs at on360.ca. Thank you for following the project, including today's policy brief. Stay tuned for another round of policy analysis and policy recommendations related to the big opportunities and challenges facing the province of Ontario. I know that if we continue to be able to bring leading experts like George to bear on these questions, we'll have made a useful contribution to public policy analysis and debate in the province of Ontario. Thank you so much. Thank you, George. Have a nice day.